Who are we? James Hamer-Morton and Charlie Bond, also known as James and Charlie from Deadlocked escape rooms. We've done this, and open up 4 escape room venues.
When we're not living puzzles, we're actors, and seem to be seen mainly in the bargain basement DVDs of HMV, Walmart, that kind of thing. In generally terrible schlocky horror.
Hey! Back in the room! Trust us, you don't want to see that.
What you may not realise is that over the past year, there's been a global pandemic, and that has severely affected our business, you know, by being closed for months and having landlords demand full rent for premises we aren't allowed to use.
So, the pandemic hit. We knew we needed a source of income, so quickly jumped into releasing a digital game, The Insiders. It's 3 90-minute chapters, an alternative reality game that gives you documents to print, sleuthing across the internet, and a load of online interfaces to interact with.
We're going to be talking about our digital escape games, like The Insiders, and generally making escape room style experiences in other formats.
Using the formats in which we were constrained, embracing their strengths and weaknesses.
How to twist our standard escape room game mechanics.
What makes something an escape game?
How people treat products on different formats.
What people actually want in these kind of games.
Coaxing people into wanting different things.
Evilly.
And some takeaways that we learned can be applied to normal live escape games. Now, how did we react so quickly to get such an in-depth and huge product out within a few days of the lockdown? Did we have advanced knowledge of the global catastrophe?
There's no proof either way. Circumstantial evidence at best. The story that we're going with is that we weren't planning to release a box product, so we had a lot of content ready. We could get it up within a few days.
We made what we made because, as creatives, we suffer very strongly from imposter syndrome. We're terrified that people will find out that maybe we're terrible at what we do. So we overcompensate. Instead of making an hour-long experience, we made one that took most people 6 hours and cost only 10 English pounds.
Actually, we stupidly gave it away for free originally, as a way to encourage our existing bookings not to cancel. Take a gift voucher instead of a refund, because we don't have the money to refund you, and we'll give you a free game for the lockdown.
People seem to love it, so we started using it as a way to sell more vouchers to keep the cash coming in. Buy a game for after lockdown, and we'll give you this game for free. And it kind of worked.
We realised that most other escape rooms hadn't been working on a product like this for months, so we offered the game to other escape room owners for free to give away with their vouchers, as a way of supporting the industry.
Then people raved about it, and so we buckled and actually sold the product too. And suddenly it became a separate business. A business tied into escape rooms that would teach us things about digital games, and even some things that we could use back in the escape room world.
While people seemed to love the style of the game we'd made, the truth is that it was made out of necessity because of the format in which we were constrained. The game was split into chapters, not only because we wanted to give a lot of content,
Imposter syndrome.
but because we wanted to make it more real and immersive. If you gave a character some information that they would use to hack into a system, we needed a reasonable period of time for them to get back to you, so we built in a pause at the end of each chapter of a few days before the character that you had just interacted with would get back in touch with you.
In a recent poll, we asked our audience if it was annoying to have to wait, despite the fact that we offered players a chance to skip the break. 62% of players said the surprise of when the character would get back in touch was worth it. This unique design feature, however, was less about making a cool concept. The truth is,
We hadn't finished it, all right? Fine, you pushed, and now you know. We were reeling from having to refund months of bookings, and we realised we needed the game up, fast.
we were constrained into releasing episodically, and this format had strengths and weaknesses that we learnt very quickly we needed to account for to bring our experiences to a new format. You see, we wanted something that would stop people demanding refunds.
Have a 3-part epic narrative game with hours of content that you'll get for free if you accept a gift voucher. It sounds a lot better than I'll give you a Sudoku and a spot the difference for your money.
We figured that if we factored a few day delay into the game structure, that would give us a little extra time to finish the next part. And it worked. And we stumbled across something that was really fun that we ended up using in our future games.
It's so important to look at what format you're using and how you can maximise the potential of that format. When we were first making the Insiders, we had to create content quickly, and we realised we wanted a lot of stuff all over the internet, yet we're hitting a financial crisis ourselves. We didn't have the money to splash out to register, host and make 20 different websites.
Instead, we looked at what we had access to and used the format as a strength. Playing a game at home doesn't have the same restrictions on internet use as an escape room. Why couldn't we include things that already existed to add scale to our own creations? Social media platforms and knowledge that already existed on the net could become a tool for us to expand our offering with free content and free hosting.
It's cheap and easy to create social media accounts, and sleuthing through them became a big fun part of the Insiders. In our next game, The Sipstress, we leveraged some of those accounts again, since they already existed, so you may come across characters and pages that we'd already made, but for different reasons.
It did come with its own problems, however. People would reply to tweets or comment on posts, things that weren't part of our carefully curated puzzles, confusing future players, and even Facebook algorithms stopped showing some essential posts to some users that led to us having to provide different ways of coming across this information.
But allowing and encouraging players to use their initiative led to puzzles that would never have existed otherwise. Outside knowledge became a benefit rather than something to avoid. In what escape room would you need to know the exact town that a band played in on a specific date in 2019? When you have access to Google, it becomes an exciting and realistic hunt for information that tasks players with using their initiative in a way that couldn't be done in any other format.
Realism was something we really tried to go to town with, within reason. In the Sipstress, we couldn't actually send your team to a Greek island, surprised, but they could absolutely be the main character's mission control and communicate with the character through an elaborate chatbot that hopefully feels a lot more like you're dealing with an actual person and continues the game when you've said the right answer to them.
This way, chatting with a character would feel exactly how it would if you really were sat at your computer, helping a globe-trotting adventurer get through his challenges. Unfortunately, there's a big assumption in digital games that is different to live escape games.
That everyone must escape.
Unlike a normal escape room, where failing is a thing, if someone buys an online game, they expect to get to the end. Obvious, right? But unfortunately, you have a lot of very stupid people out there.
We originally planned that everyone would only get clues in the Insiders by emailing a character within the game that we would use to respond to them in a cleverly in-character way.
Maybe we could take another look at those pictures. They can't be irrelevant. Has the artist done a number on them?
Of course, that works when you have a few customers playing a game per day. When suddenly the BBC features your tiny little escape room and you have hundreds of players all asking for help while being unable to follow simple clues, well...
We gave up. We provided a hint page. At the time, we had no better way of dealing with the masses. We wanted to encourage players to properly think before we replied, in the hope that they'd take their time, think things through before shouting,
"Clue!"
But for every enthusiast that wanted to understand every puzzle was
"Clue!"
And we made a worse mistake. At 2 a.m, we were getting calls.
"Clue!"
At 4 a.m, they'd been given it by an escape room in the USA and were annoyed that at 4 a.m. UK time they hadn't received an email reply within 20 minutes.
We learnt pretty fast that with the game that we had created, we had to provide a hint page. But we weren't happy, so we vowed to figure out a better way of handling the format for next time. Next time.
Next time, in the Sipstress, we were using our chatbot, and it turns out that despite providing a hint page at first, people go straight to send you a message through your character, which we of course monitored. At some point, we were getting a message a second as each player on each of the teams playing was asking for help at the same time. But this led us to another weakness with the format.
Help. Just help. That's what they'd say, but unlike a normal escape room where you have so many different factors in the game, we don't know what they're stuck with. We don't even know what puzzle they're trying to solve unless they've literally just typed a wrong answer that we're already expecting. And what's worse, because the chatbot is, naturally, quick to respond to correct answers, if we take longer than a few seconds, the player gets annoyed, no matter the time of day.
Unlike an escape room, we can't give a clue based upon what we've observed them doing in a room. When we figured out the weakness, we could approach it in a different way to make it a benefit. Since we were already using a chatbot, we could tailor the messages to request certain key phrases and structure them in a way that made any help seem in character.
The character would describe what they needed, perhaps some coordinates, and then say something like, "And if you need any help, just tell me what you need me to look at, the 360 video or the star map." Our bot would then listen out not only for the answer, but for phrases like 360 video and star map, which would lead to more specific clues, tailor-made to where they must be in the game, starting with a subtle nudge and gradually getting more prescriptive as we continued the conversation.
It made it much more rare for us to need to step in, and it gave a far more immersive feel to the game.
Now, using different formats, such as the book or anything outside the standard escape room, removes another limitation: the timer. I spent a lot of time in a talk about the Escape Room Puzzles book talking about how respecting someone's time is one of the biggest takeaways from trying to write something that I originally thought was better the longer it was. Instead, it's important to note that especially when players may not be expecting the length of experience that they receive, expectations are important.
Without a timer, you can afford to give people complicated puzzles that may take 15 minutes to solve and involve multiple lengthy steps that may seem like a huge time sink in a 60-minute room. In fact, we use this strength most notably in a very divisive puzzle that the Insiders is probably most known for: the server machine.
This puzzle involves many different phases and instructions that had to be completed in sequence, and taught you each stage gradually and slowly. A good playthrough of this puzzle can take 20 minutes, even if you know what you're doing. Its difficulty wouldn't necessarily be fair in a time-limited game, but the challenge was only one part of this format that we were looking at.
A big weakness of digital games separates them greatly from escape rooms: the fact that most of them can be solved solo, by one player.
It turns out, creating puzzles that legitimately require multiple players to work together is remarkably hard in a digital format, without it seeming really contrived.
Our server puzzle gave one player a simple skill-based task to keep them occupied to keep the puzzle working, while the others in the team have to work out what other inputs the player should be doing.
We decided to allow physical manipulation of printable pages in the Insiders. It was our way of making sure the whole thing didn't feel like a video game. We used that format to allow players to build a papercraft trophy at the end. But even this would have been a weakness to just throw a lot of work at players after they'd just solved a beast of an experience and expect them to take the time to self-congratulate. Not a euphemism.
Instead, we created puzzles around separate parts of the trophy, so, unbeknownst to the player, you ended up building sections of it over the course of the game. When you completed it, you had just a tiny bit more work that we hoped would feel more worthwhile.
Our biggest weakness to a new format was that the market left to players stranded at home in a lockdown was not just about us escape room companies putting out games that would hopefully support paying our rent. Our format pitted us against video games and against existing play-at-home boxed products, and even our own play-at-home products.
When you can buy an amazing puzzle video game for 99p on an app store that might give you hours of entertainment, we think it's really important to give people something different. We can't compete in price with a 99p app, or in quality with a game made by a crew of hundreds, so we had to be different. Our format has to become something no industry other than ours is offering.
This forced us to figure out what we could offer that was different. And that was a combination of all these things to create something new that was as close to escape rooms as we could make.
Using the strengths and weaknesses of the format naturally led us to twisting gameplay mechanics. Removing the timer is undoubtedly a biggie that changes the whole structure of the game.
More time available means that you may be working on things for longer than you're expecting, if you're expecting a standard escape game. When we twist a gameplay mechanic, it's important that a player knows it, otherwise you risk these expectations ruining their experience. If someone is in the mindset of a game working in certain ways, then unless you can telegraph the difference, it could confuse or frustrate a player.
In a live escape game, it could be down to unwritten rules such as don't mess with the cameras, or even something like a key or a code can only be used once. There are games that twist these mechanics to surprise players, but sometimes it comes down to what you say in a briefing, and often this is only an issue when multiple groups make the same mistake.
Back when we started, we were looking for ways to avoid using endless padlocks for every puzzle that gave you a number code, and to make your experience more realistic. One of our solutions was a filing cabinet with hundreds of files. At some point in the game, you find a reference to a specific file, and that leads you to where you're meant to be. We had to put a ton of files in the cabinet so that players wouldn't think that they had to search through every single one.
Undoubtedly, there are games where this is necessary, and good design is about telegraphing to players what you're expecting them to do without giving away the puzzle. You'll always get players that think that your telegraphing is a trick, in the same way that you can tell every player that the plug socket a lamp is plugged into is real and you won't need to go digging around inside it. Yet you're bound to get a player that assumes that's actually a clue.
So training by doing, especially when you're working in unusual formats, can be the most powerful tool. Our ARG style of searching around the internet for information was something some people initially resisted. At one point during the Seifstress, you come across a series of Greek letters which you form into a sentence. We assumed you'd find a sentence and then put it into Google Translate to find out what it meant. Simple, right?
Except it wasn't simple. Some had the escape room mindset that no outside knowledge should be required, which was a fair assumption for a game released by an escape room company. We'd get players contacting us complaining that they couldn't find a way of translating the Greek words. It simply hadn't occurred to them to use the tools that they had access to over the internet to solve a puzzle. Many of them wondered if it was cheating.
We decided to add it to the confirmation email, a how to play section, and even on a help page to let people know what kind of game it was, and that the entirety of the internet was at your disposal. It didn't seem to make a difference. People just wouldn't read the FAQ or the how to play section. Outside knowledge was such a twist to gameplay that we had to actively train players to do it within the game.
Solutions we've used for this include characters directly asking people to look things up for them early on, or using nudges such as, "My internet signal is weak, can I leave this up to you folk?" As soon as we had a couple of those early on, no one seemed to make the same mistake again. Whilst we're not expecting people to solve everything instantly, failing because they don't understand the format or what is expected of them is clearly not what we want. It's like when someone solves a puzzle in a live room and puts the code in the padlock wrong. That's not where you want someone to mess up.
Understanding that our style of ARG wasn't a closed system, as in everything you need is within the game itself, like a live escape room, was only one expectation we needed to handle. While there are a couple of notable exceptions, players aren't expecting to take breaks in an escape room, and when they expect a similar experience, it can cause problems. With the Escape Room Puzzles book, clearly broken into chapters, it was an easier sell to assume that readers wouldn't necessarily get through it all in one. With our digital games, especially with them being so different to other games on the market, even after reading about them being multiple chapters, without splitting them up clearly, many figured that they would just power through.
Players can stop and start at any point with no penalty in a digital game. And more than that, it's one thing to tell them it's approximately 3 90-minute chapters and something quite different to sit down and experience it. We had one reviewer slate us because they said that they were good at escape rooms and therefore should be able to get through our 3-hour game in an hour. When you have an hour in the room, give or take, and you know your experience will be over around them, it's easy to stay focused, even though you don't know how many more puzzles there are.
When we've played rooms, we've always told games masters that we trust their judgment with regards to if we need a clue or not. They are the ones that know how much more there is to do and if we're in a good or bad pace. By removing the concept of pace, it becomes very hard for a player to judge if they're doing well or not, and if they should take a hint.
The necessity of providing self-propelled clues when you have potentially a lot of players at once or allowing them to start at any time in any time zone was another mechanic we twisted. Now, we've seen games that have successfully allowed players to claim their own clues, a QR code by every puzzle that they had to scan with a provided iPad in the room.
Business-wise, it totally makes sense to run games like that, since groups need a lot less minding, and it's possible to run many games like that in real life at once, cutting down staff costs substantially. But they are a far cry from how we like to run our games.
Our games have always had a focus on narrative and character interaction. We think that if a character is interacting with you and chatting with you throughout the entire game, you can get away with nudging players far more subtly to make them feel like they've done more themselves. When players call into a vent in our spaceship, an onboard AI and your little companion robot have a little chat about it.
Hey, what are you two doing inside my vent?
I think they're getting cozy.
Ah, biological life forms.
This means that every time they talk, even if they're nudging you towards the right answer, it doesn't feel like players have been given a clue. The less assistance you can give a team, the better in general. We had to go against that with our clue system for the digital games. A page of hints, essentially a walkthrough, is much more necessary for a game that requires everyone to be able to win.
But how far can you twist something before it no longer becomes an escape game? What exactly is an escape game?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this when first pitching the escape room puzzles book to a publisher. Essentially, there are enough escape games that don't actually insist you escape a room that I don't consider escaping a necessity. It had to have multi-stage puzzles. In a regular escape room, this might look like this. A puzzle gives you a code, which you use on this cryptex, which gives you a key, which you use to open a box. One thing leads on to another. Hey, I didn't say this was a good multi-stage puzzle.
For us, we wanted our virtual escape to also focus on the cooperative side of things, especially given the lockdown. Everyone was isolated at home, unable to socialise with their friends.
That's when we made the aforementioned server machine. Not every puzzle in an escape game needed to require multiple players. In fact, being cooperative can absolutely apply to any puzzle if different players' inputs can be taken into account.
We made a similar style machine for the Seistress, a little more complicated but fairer, where each player would take a different side of a machine and have different things to do. As one player solved something, they would communicate that information to the other player, who would be able to use that information and solve something on their side, which gave them something to communicate back, etc.
It may be our favourite part of the game, but we knew it risked isolating solo players. We decided to add a solo player mode and allowed you to swap sides at will. That actually ended up being useful for teams that only had one device to play on too.
That way, we could further encourage the collaborative feel of what an escape game was to us. So, we had multi-stage puzzles and cooperative gameplay. The other aspects to escape games didn't seem so important.
We could have put a timer on the whole thing, but considered that it's only a necessity in live escape games because you have to make sure you're ready for the next team. Other than that, we felt that we were hitting the marks on allowing us to call our products virtual escape rooms.
Virtual escape rooms, however, led to different kinds of behaviours from our guests. It's like when you have a corporate team building event in a live escape room. The players haven't necessarily chosen to be there and certainly haven't paid, so they tend to treat the experience with less respect. They're less careful with props and get bored easier.
Playing over the internet, never coming face to face with the games master, and perhaps even thinking that they're only talking to a bot, leads to a sense of autonomity that means we have seen some pretty awful behaviour. We get, almost on a daily basis, people swearing at us, perhaps because it's funny for them, some explicit pictures, and even requests for us to show our genitalia.
Did we comply to try to get better reviews? Our lawyers tell us not to comment.
This separation between the makers and players certainly has an adverse effect on virtual escape rooms, but perhaps our chatbot mitigated that as much as possible by giving some players the question of whether or not it is a real person on the other end.
But the format itself gave us more problems with regards to making the game too, and specifically when it comes to the testing phase. It's funny how many people come to us asking if they can test our next game, as if that will just be the same as playing an escape room but free. For those that aren't designers and owners that happen to be watching, it goes a little something like this. Oh, one puzzle spoiler for our game, The Phoenix Research, ahead.
We make a puzzle. It's pretty obvious to us. We're worried it's too easy. On one side of the room is this lovely poster. On another is a series of keys with the same colours on their keyring, in the same layout as the poster. Obvious, right? You're meant to rearrange the keyrings to this order. Except it's really not obvious. When you wander into a room, there's so much to look at and so many distractions that it may be minutes before you've seen everything in the room. And only then might you possibly make the connection.
When we look at a puzzle in isolation, it's easy to spot patterns pattern recognition or figure out what you can do with each aspect. To the player, they're still wondering if they even can do anything with the keyring yet. Maybe they'll find something later on that helps them, but as soon as you understand the puzzle, it's way harder to imagine how hard a player will find it. Testing is not just about making sure that everything works. It's about making sure that the puzzles are fair, that there is enough telegraphing of each stage, and that players can actually solve it. And that's one of the biggest challenges in escape room design.
Digital games were a whole new beast. Everything we'd learnt about telegraphing from our real rooms goes out of the window if players are looking at things over the internet, perhaps on separate browsers, with their friends' faces in little windows distracting them.
And what's worse, it's not easy to test puzzles. With our chatbots, you can only see what they type in. We don't know what they're trying to solve, what their thought processes are if things aren't clear, or even what they're struggling on if we make any kind of non-linearity to the game. We needed to treat our format differently and have players play the game in a way that they wouldn't normally. We asked some of our testers to stream the game online to us so that we could see the discussions and figure out how someone new to the game would both approach the puzzles but think them through.
And tweaking the games continues to this day. A little change in wording can have a huge effect on how people react to puzzles, and that then has further consequences down the line.
Then there's the possibility for breaks. If you're playing a live escape room, you're not going to just walk out, grab some lunch, and then come back to finish the room. Digital games are treated very differently. You already know you can play at your own pace, and therefore do it how you like. That frustrated us a lot when it came to giving people specific clues. We'd get in conversation with a player and wonder why it had been 20 minutes since we gave them the last clue and they still hadn't solved the puzzle.
Dinner time. That was probably it. But it meant that as soon as we were live, it was harder and harder to get a read on how people were playing. The opposite of how it is for a live escape game. Taking breaks at random times also affects the difficulty of the puzzles. If you've just seen the keyrings puzzle and then you spot the poster, you're a lot more likely to figure it out than if you've looked at half the room, took a break of an hour or a day or weeks in some cases, and then came back. You'd find it a lot harder.
So, bearing in mind what we can control and what we can't, we had to do our best to make the experience work for as many people as possible and what they want in a virtual escape room.
By restricting hints originally, we were trying to force people to play the game in a way we wanted them to play it. But when you look back at live escape rooms, we tend to give players a lot more choice in how they play.
We much prefer playing as a team of two. Some people prefer large teams. More brains, more chance of success. We would never force someone to do it one way or another, and remembering that should be applied to as many things as possible.
Once our games were live, we made the gap between our chapters optional. Players could jump forward if they wanted. We let them play the experience they wanted to play.
If they valued the excitement of not knowing when the next part was coming, they could have that surprise. If they had their team ready to go and wanted to play on, they could.
The same thing applied to clues. We wanted to limit them, to encourage people to take time to think things through. Yet those that just wanted to zoom through and basically be told what to do the second they got even slightly stuck could do that by providing that option.
The closest analogy we could think of in real-life escape rooms is spinning the lock. Imagine you have 4 different puzzles, each giving you a digit of a padlock. Once you've found 3 of the numbers, your team is either the type that wants to solve that last puzzle or wants to spin the lock until they find the solution. Are they about getting the best time? Or are they about seeing everything in the game?
We used to get frustrated at the former. Why don't you want to solve this last wonderful puzzle that I designed? The truth is, it's the player's game, and we should allow them to solve it how they want, how they will get the most pleasure. We started thinking that spinning the lock was actually a benefit because it allowed us something else to show them in the debrief. We've taken to adopting the same attitude in our digital games.
One puzzle in the Cystrus involves you figuring out the birthday of one of the characters. Originally, we were going to overly complicate it so that we knew that they'd solved the puzzle legitimately. In the end, we realised that giving them a limited number of solutions gave players the option to hack the solution.
To actively encourage brute forcing a puzzle seems totally counterintuitive. Yet in a genre where everyone must win, at the point where you're frustrated enough to try all of the options, Why shouldn't we allow the player to make that decision and feel like they had outsmarted us? This was also at a part of the game where it was much harder to clue them in character, which led to a perfect opportunity to avoid some frustration.
Can this be part of a real-life escape room? Actually, yes. In our game, The Testing Chamber, our initial area is an elaborate test by a rogue AI. You've got to solve a few puzzles, ending with some instructions to wander around the room. In the end, your final instruction is push. You push the suspicious-looking wall and it opens out into a new room.
We love this part because it's a great equalizer. A brilliant team will solve the puzzle, fully experience it all, and get out of this area in about 10 minutes. A terrible team will lose focus at around 10 minutes and try to outsmart us, realizing that the last instruction is push, see the questionable wall, and try it.
Bam! They're through this section with no clues, on target, and feel smart again, all because we opened up our game to let people tell us what they wanted, the way they wanted to play.
But what people wanted was more than just gameplay. We have often targeted our games at enthusiasts and equated length with value. More and more, it's clear that people have had issues with the length of our games, and not in a good way.
Whilst some think like us, thrilled at the volume of content, more often than not, we've seen players frustrated that they haven't been able to finish 6 hours of the Insiders in one go because they've got tired and puzzled out.
Now, we didn't deliberately put filler in our game. We assumed people would take breaks where we suggested, but more often than not, they didn't. Then complained that they were tired, and the majority of players seemed to want an experience that they can get through in one sitting.
But what if you know better than the players what is good for them? Much like a child being forced to eat their vegetables, sometimes players don't know better. The closest approximation I can think of for a live escape game is when a player has the correct idea, starts trying it, but is nervous about looking stupid, so literally asks for a clue. Do you give them a clue, or do you tell them that they're doing the right thing?
Obviously, you have to react and tell them something. Otherwise, they're likely to feel like you're not even watching the game. But while they've directly asked for a clue, you've diffused their request by telling them they're doing the right thing, and therefore not ruined the satisfaction of them figuring out the puzzle. With our live games, as mentioned before, we try to make it conversational with our characters so that we can jump in with jokes or situational comments when the situation allows. It means that we can come in early and tell them they're doing the right thing as a confidence boost and confirming they're on the right track.
In a way, that's a trick of being an experienced games master, coaxing players out of asking for something that we know risks diminishing their enjoyment of the game. In our digital games, we had to do similar things unique to the format. Firstly, suggesting breaks.
By having a character outright tell you that they will be back in touch in a few days, or even using language such as binge in our store pages, we set the precedent that playing the whole thing in one go isn't usual. And frankly, that gives us a lot of forgiveness for those who found it hard because they've been solving puzzles for 6 hours.
This is actually more of a retroactive coax. We can't absolutely control whether someone takes a break, but when they look back on it afterwards, they realise that perhaps they should have taken our advice, and it improves their overall feeling towards the experience.
We look at it like a difficult puzzle. If someone fails to solve it and considers it impossible or says the immortal line, "Does anyone manage to solve that?" we know they've got a negative view on the puzzle. If they can't solve it, and then when presented with the solution they say, "Oh, we're so stupid, we should have seen that," then it's a much more positive view of the same experience. It works exactly the same with any format or experience. If there's a problem with the format that you literally can't get around, like binging the game in one, then as long as you can negate it with a suggested way to play, a player will find it very hard to think negatively based on their decision.
The Insiders is a print-at-home game. By making it clear that it's our intended way to play, even though with some clever spatial awareness it can be solved without a printer, it's a lot harder for a player to complain that it was too hard to complete without a printer. Hard, but not impossible, we learned. Ultimately, you can only go so far that way. We've even had players complain that a game we clearly stated requires a laptop or a desktop doesn't work on their phone.
At least poor reviews based upon player stupidity shouldn't be as much of a problem as something that was the designer's fault. Giving subtle nudges and clues, though, can absolutely help coax players into similar behaviours in the virtual games too.
We've already spoken about our chatbots, But a big part of player frustration can come from people that want to play the game clueless. But what exactly does that mean when we talk about a game like the Sipstress?
When our bot reminds you of the format that he wants the answer in, is that a clue? The last thing we want to do is give you a clue just because you've taken a guess with something and not given you the time to properly think things through, especially in a game where there are no time limits. We figured that someone actively asking for help or going to a hint page was the point where people consider that they have taken a clue, which means our subtle nudging was a way of coaxing players into taking help without feeling like they had.
It's obvious when it works too, as you can see players typing in everything that they find to see if there's anything that our character will say about it that might help. When it works well, we've prepared a funny line of dialogue or even pre-recorded some audio interaction to lead them in the right direction. It feels like they've succeeded by getting that prompt, rather than been given help because they haven't quite got it right yet. A great example of this is a puzzle in the Sipstress. Spoilers ahead, translating a Greek sentence gives you drink of the gods?
Yes, there is a question mark at the end, to suggest that you're looking for an answer rather than just the phrase drink of the gods. You're faced with putting that somehow into this wall. A Google search should let you know that nectar is the drink of the gods, and the Greek for that is vektap. Push the stones in that order and it's a success. Our conversational bot responds to someone saying drink of the gods, or the weirdly popular answer drink the goddess, with where have I heard something like that before? What could be called the drink of the gods? Perhaps a quick internet search might help.
Again, that encourages outside knowledge, and if the player is not thinking about how to use it on the actual puzzle, they'll say nectar to the character which plays this audio. We've coaxed our audience into using the character as a resource rather than a help page, and rewarded them with some content that makes this feel like this is the intended action, rather than just solving the puzzle directly.
There is an art to finding the right way to coax players to perform different actions. It can be as simple as having a flashing red button, someone will push it, or leaving one piece of a jigsaw inside where you're expecting players to build the final thing. But often it comes down to testing to see what works, and what you may be unintentionally coaxing people towards.
So that's a snippet of our insight into making games in different formats. But what if you've been distracted by the dodgy green screen and hilarious jokes throughout? What if you're now brain dead from all this information? Well, that's what this section is about. The takeaways from our talk.
The first thing you should be doing in any project, in any format, is to look at the format itself and use it to its maximum potential, strengths and weaknesses. We have pre-recorded characters in our games because we can't afford to hire actors for each and every group. Your limitations can become your strengths. Got no way of watching players run your digital game? Get them to interact with a character in-game as part of it. Got a tiny space for your live escape room? Make it into a feature. That vent in a spaceship we spoke about earlier. That's because we had some space that went under some stairs, so it inspired our design. As long as something can be justified as being deliberate, it won't be a weakness to your project. It's why many avatar-led games now use inventory systems. They've taken a weakness of being unable to examine things separately and in depth, and used the format to restore classic non-linear gameplay. Let players play games how they want to play. Don't be afraid of allowing situations where they can hack puzzles and feel smart about outthinking you. Resign yourself to letting people spin the last number in a lock and plan for it. But bear in mind, there are players that will want to solve everything and will never spin a lock.
While we've always loved that the escape room industry is so collaborative, consider what competition your format has and find a way to be different. You'll never be able to compete with an industry of experts that have been doing it with a higher budget than you for all of their working lives, so make something that doesn't fit into their industry, and it'll be able to stand on its own 2 feet.
When you're working in a new format, you have to consider it as a new business. We've seen too many escape room companies make something digital quick, cheap, and, well, terrible, then sell it for a high price because that's what they reckon they need to keep paying their live escape games rent. You'd never start a bakery and charge $1,000 for a piece of bread because you're using it to fund buying airplanes for your airline, so don't expect the same revenue from a new business.
Testing is so important in every format. The harder it is to test, the more important it is to get it right before you put it out to the general public.
Remember that the popularity of a format is determined by a lot of factors and rarely the quality of the product. Digital games would have never taken off so much if it weren't for global lockdowns, and we've already seen waning popularity as lockdowns end.
Make sure you have confirmation in games on every format. Letter locks that spell out words is the simplest example. In digital, it may be a password that opens your next page, or a chatbot saying something congratulatory.
Coax people into wanting what will make it a better game. If they're happy to chat to a bot, then subtle nudges in character work far better than players relying on a hint page that may lead them to feel like they've failed or given up. Characters and world building can be used to remove and twist mechanics, such as a clue system.
Do seriously consider the length of your game and whether or not you're going to encourage chapters. Remember, there will always be players that ignore advice, and you need to have considered how to make them feel like they should have listened to your advice rather than just getting annoyed at your game. Make sure the players' expectations are reasonable and successfully achieved. Define them when selling your game.
And when you're working in a new format, it's not just you that's new to it. Players need to be trained into how best to play this game you've created. Tell them outright, in this context of the story if possible, whenever you're expecting them to do something that they might be resistant to.
Phew! I reckon that about does it. Thanks so much for sitting through all of this, or for joining later so that we feel better about ourselves.
We've been James and Charlie from Deadlocked Escape Rooms, and we'll be live now for some questions.
Hi, I'm David.
And I'm Lisa. And we're from RoomEscapeArtist.com, the hosts of RECON, the Reality Escape Convention.
This was one of 15 talks that we put on at RECON Global this year, a digital convention for the escape room and immersive gaming industries, for players and for owners and everyone in between. They gathered on August 23rd and 24th of 2020.
We're releasing all 15 of these talks about once a week over the coming months so that they'll be accessible to you. To find them, you subscribe here to the Room Escape Artist YouTube channel. And if you're interested in more information about RECON, go to realityescapecon.com and subscribe to the newsletter.
We put on RECON completely for free because we didn't want there to be financial barriers. We are, however, supported by our Patreons, and so we're thankful to those who are already supporting us. And if you have the ability to support us right now, and you want to, and you like what we're doing, we would really appreciate it. People who back us get early access to these videos along with a whole bunch of other perks.
That is the Room Escape Artist Patreon page. And if you're enjoying these videos and this industry, please support the creators in the space. Play their games in person or virtually. They're doing so many innovative things right now, and we hope that you'll enjoy those.
Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next video.